We start now with the final round. I'm quite grateful for everyone who still joined us in this final session. Thanks a lot for your ambition, for your patience. It has been indeed a very long working day with intense discussions. This panel will be held in English, but translation is still available. My name is Helmut Sachs. I am from the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights, which is an academic research center in Vienna in the field of human rights issues. And apart from that, I'm also a member of GRETA, which is the Council of Europe expert group on action against trafficking in human beings, which is the main monitoring body for the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention. And from that perspective, at least, I've gained quite a lot of knowledge, experience from a wide range of countries, because GRETA has the possibility to actually go to countries to have discussions with civil society, with authorities on the measures taken to implement the Anti-Trafficking Convention, which makes it an excellent experience, opportunity for me to learn a lot. And perhaps I can also share some lessons learned also in the context of this final round. But the basic purpose of this final gathering, of course, is to learn from the workshops, from the discussions you just had in terms of findings. I would also be quite interested in getting a feeling of what have been the most controversial issues from our rapporteurs then, or what kind of issues have met a lot of consensus actually. Before that, just allow me to briefly comment also what has happened along the day. One interesting remark I found was actually from Professor O'Connell right in the morning, when she spoke about ambiguities and the impact ambiguity of concepts might have, that it might limit access to protection. I think one could even say ambiguity is the enemy to action in terms of unclear concepts, who takes the lead, who has a responsibility. Are we speaking of trafficking cases? Is it forced labor? Is it other forms of exploitation? I think that's a very valid point, and hopefully our discussions from the workshops will allow us to get a bit of a clearer picture. The same as we had the panel discussions over the day. Ambiguities, also in that context, that I had a look at some press releases I found on the first EU Anti-Trafficking Day 10 years ago. In that context, media agencies still spoke of the sad reality of children and women in the context of trafficking, quite strongly ignoring actually the gender dimension, that there's also exploitation of men. So in that respect, we have come quite a long way. Just this week, the European Commission has also published a comprehensive review of anti-trafficking projects. More than 300 projects have been funded over the last 12 years, with some up to 150 million euros spent on these projects. So actually, to some extent, there is a lot of expertise available. On the other hand, we still have a long way to go. In this respect, I would just mention also the importance of having a human rights-based approach to trafficking issues. Because for our societies, rule of law, democracy, human rights are actually the foundation, are the basis for stable societies also. But especially in the migration context, my feeling is that sometimes human rights have become a kind of a luxury I think there's a need to stop the kind of pull factor discussions that if we grant rights to victims of trafficking or to migrants, whoever, then actually this will lead that the numbers will to a situation where the numbers increase. Actually, that's completely missing the point. It's not a luxury, it's not a privilege to have rights, it's a natural right we all have and which has been confirmed over the last 60, 70 years in international documents, in regional documents, and of course in all the national documents as far as human rights catalogs and constitutions are concerned. At the same time, I think a human rights-based approach will also help to ensure that we are really focusing on the individual person, the human being, victim of trafficking, be it a migrant, be it a migrant worker, whatever context there might be, in order to get actually the understanding of what are the interests at stake from a person's own perspective. I was just present in the workshop on child trafficking. Also children have, to a certain extent, the autonomy. They have a right also to self-determination. They have specific motives which can be very strong, and at the same time in the trafficking area they are in situations of dependency. And to break through that cycle of dependency, to make attractive offers for children to come forward to report the situation, perhaps even to authorities or at least to civil society, that's quite a difficult task, a challenge for them. But on the other hand, we have to take them seriously, otherwise all our action will not be effective in the end. I can confirm this from Greta's perspective, from our more than 50 country reports we have published so far, covering basically all Council of Europe member states, except 2 countries are missing, the Czech Republic and Russia. But apart from that, on our Greta website, you can find reports on basically all the countries in the region. And we did a stock taking last year of the first evaluation cycle, the first 4 years of our monitoring. And we also found that actually it's not in the law enforcement area where there is a need to have a stronger focus, but it's rather on the situation of the victims, to guarantee victims' rights, to assistance, to comprehensive assistance, to legal assistance for trafficking victims, for example. The question of assistance not being linked to cooperation with police, residence permits not being linked to cooperation with police, and then also some trafficking-specific elements like this concept of a recovery and reflection period. We touched on it briefly already today, that there is a possibility for victims to think about the situation and make an informed decision then to what extent they want to act as a witness in a court proceeding and to what extent they want to enjoy the assistance from service providers, or the non-punishment principle, also one of the most difficult concepts to implement. And from our stock-taking experience in the Council of Europe context, we can soundly claim that it's basically that kind of implementation of anti-trafficking convention is the weakest part. And above all, the situation of children is the greatest concern, should be the greatest concern. In our findings, basically almost all countries received urgent recommendations to address the identification and assistance to children. And this, I'm coming quite to an end. This goes in hand with the observation that, especially as far as children are concerned, already before the migration crisis, we have found a lot of indications that child protection systems actually do not work in so many countries in Europe, meaning mechanisms of referral of children to service providers, that there's a close cooperation between the juvenile or the child and youth protection authorities, with police, with doctors, with labor inspectors in so many areas, which would then allow to have a joint response to the rights and needs of those young people. So already this was happening before, and I think that the migration crisis just made it even more visible how weak our current mechanisms currently are. I think this was just a kind of a preliminary remark, or some messages I also wanted to share with you before we now start in the presentation of the findings, with the presentation of the findings from the workshops. I've heard all of you have been very active. Some rooms have been quite crowded. So again, I'm very grateful for all of you who still stayed with us. And I would like now to start with the first workshop. Evelyn Probst from LEFE to just briefly explain the key messages from your workshops and the main findings and possible next steps to take. Thank you.
Thank you. Our workshop was Old Men, Young Women, Vulnerable Groups and Stereotypes in the Context of Human Trafficking. The main interest and the main focus of the workshop was one thing, to focus again, what are we talking about? What is when we are talking about trafficking human beings, what is the framework, where are we moving in? So we focused on explaining the legal situation and bringing back what is the street levels of how to identify a THP, and we brought up the combination with that it's not only important to identify a trafficked person, but the biggest importance is to identify the crime. And I think this is like, this was one of the focus we put into. And there is a necessity, if we are able to identify the crime, to deconstruct typical stereotypes. Who could be that ones who are affected by that? It goes a little bit with that, what Helmut already mentioned in the beginning. So the focus was to see that it hinders us to identify the crime stereotypes about the person, about gender, age, social or ethnic group, appearance and abilities, stereotypes about the activity or the sector in which a person was exploited, or the proper victim's worth to be protected and get justice. So this was the center of when we started to go into 4 working groups, where we had individual case studies, and we worked with the case studies. First step, firstly to identify, do we really talk about a crime of THP from that what we know from these case studies? Secondly, what would be the next steps, what are necessary to go for? And third, what could be done that things are getting improved? When we were talking about the next step, all the 4 groups, although these 4 cases had been very differently, there was men, women and children involved. It was a range of sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, begging, criminal activities, that the outcome of the basic needs, how to tackle the situation, was the same. It was a need on unconditional support for trafficked people. It doesn't matter what kind of exploitation they have been suffering in. It was a need on a safe surrounding and an empowering surrounding where they get back their ownership of decisions and next steps to take too. And it was a need on an intensive work by all state-owned institutions who are involved in that, means proper investigation by police, means proper recognition of the crime by the prosecutors and the juridical system, but also means a proper cooperation between all these actors in the field. And for the next steps, in the sense, what could be identified that that things are getting better. There is a big necessity of the deconstruction of stereotypes for state actors. And as I can't repeat it as often as now, again, training, but that also means going into depth trainings that we don't talk about young men and old men. We talk about different groups who could be then victims of these crimes. It's trainings needed on all levels, but there is also a need on an unconditional residence permit, which focus on the vulnerability of the person, which is one of the biggest means when we talk about THP, that this mean is that one which was the mostly abused in the situation of trafficking. There has to be a proper implementation of special protection. There has to be a really direct access to that medical services which are needed. And there is a big range of raising of social awareness on trafficking in human beings, but also the possibility how to intervene in this situation. And there is a need of changing the vision of an offender, which goes again to certain stereotypes where victims are perceived as offenders and not as that ones who had no access to their rights. We had no controversial discussions, so I couldn't raise now. Also, the group consisted of people from different backgrounds, as well as missions represented here, students and social workers in the field of working with vulnerable people.
Okay, thanks a lot. Any comments immediately from the participants of the workshop? Any aspects they would like to, or you would like to stress what Evelyn has just mentioned? Because just to explain, I think right now we will just go through the presentations and then have a final discussion at the end. But if you have immediate remarks to the topic of your own workshop, then please go forward.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. This is just a really quick question because I thought you did a really thorough job of outlining some procedures, and you talked about integration and cooperation between the different actors, and I just wondered if you, I know we had really short time, but maybe you had some thoughts on their integration between states transnationally, because there's a real gap in that area as well.
As part of the workshop, we didn't talk about, like if we had short time also in the workshop to work on these individual case studies and really from the perspective now of implementation of rights. So I can then, I think in the discussion round, add thoughts what we already have, but in the workshop we didn't discuss it.
Okay, so thanks again, Evelyn, for the presentation, and to all the participants in workshop 1. May I ask you now, Katie Klaffenberg from IOM, to give us some insights of your findings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helmut. So I moderated workshop 2. This was on the topic of child trafficking, particularly in the context of migration and refugee flows. And I was joined there by representatives of ECPAT, the Youth Welfare Services of Lower Austria, and the Youth Welfare Services of Vienna, specifically the Crisis Center Drehscheibe. And we started out the discussion by pretty much jumping into case studies. We had 4 that we discussed together with the group on just sort of various snapshots of child trafficking. For example, one of them was girls in the metro who were pickpocketing. One of them was a young asylum seeker who said that he had worked in Turkey and not received fair pay. Another was a situation in a park in Innsbruck where someone was observing drugs being sold by migrant youth. And the last one was a situation of young people on the way to Germany, accompanied by adults who did not want to stay in Austria and wanted to move on and could not say where they wanted to go in Germany. So we used this pretty much to discuss whether these situations could be child trafficking, whether there were any potential dangers for the children and youth involved in the situations, and whether they needed any sort of support. And so I think this also comes back to the term ambiguity, because in this context, that was definitely one of the things that we talked about, that a lot of these cases were quite ambiguous. Maybe they were child trafficking, maybe there was exploitation, maybe not, and that based on the information that is available to us or to the police, to social workers, that it can be really very, very difficult to ascertain, are we talking about exploitation, are we talking about child trafficking, or are we just talking about perhaps youth who have decided that they're going to try to earn money on the side by selling drugs. But one of the things that was mentioned again and again was that, children in general are a vulnerable group, this is clear, and children within migration and refugee flows are even more vulnerable, so it just makes it increasingly likely that they will be subjected to some form of abuse or exploitation. Which sort of fed into the next point, which was that in all of these situations, regardless of whether they were actually child trafficking or not, child protection mechanisms should have or should sort of be turned on and start assisting these children and adolescents. Even if it is just that they are really pickpocketing and not being exploited, not being forced to do it. And so specifically on the topic of child protection, we discussed that there were various aspects that were necessary. I think one of the main ones was talking about shelter and this sort of protection specifically for trafficked children. Because the current situation in Austria is that we cannot protect trafficked children to the extent that we can protect trafficked men and women, because there are shelters for trafficked women, for trafficked men, also for girls at the age of 15 and up. But, for example, the one specialized crisis center from the Youth Welfare Service, the Drehscheibe, is a public institution, and so the address is well known, which is a problem in terms of protection. So one of the suggestions that was made is that it would be very beneficial to have 2 shelters for trafficked children in Austria that are really specifically specialized on the topic of child trafficking, because one of the challenges being faced by the Drehscheibe at the moment is that they actually have 2 different target groups. One is trafficked children, and the other target group is unaccompanied foreign minors, and that it is very difficult in practice to properly assist these groups in one shelter. One of the issues of contention that was discussed was whether it is good to have open shelters or closed shelters. Currently, the way the law is in Austria, it's not possible to have closed shelters for children unless we're talking about a psychiatric institute. And that was a topic that was not, we did not find closure on that, but it was something that was mentioned that should be maybe discussed more openly in the Austrian context. Another point on child protection that was mentioned repeatedly was that more outreach is needed. So outreach not just to trafficked children, also to other vulnerable children. So talking about social work, work of the youth welfare services. So even before it's clear that it's trafficking, these children need to be assisted. There needs to be more outreach. And another topic that we briefly mentioned was just the new national referral mechanism on child trafficking that has been mentioned a few times today. So it was just briefly presented and explained with the goal of increasing protection for trafficked children, making it clear how suspected cases or potential victims of child trafficking should be referred so that they receive protection. But since it's a very new mechanism, it remains to be seen what will actually happen in practice and what effect this new mechanism will have. So yes, those were the main points that we discussed.
Thanks, Katie. Again, the question for the group, anything to add? Or questions for clarifications, perhaps, but it was a very comprehensive account anyway. Yeah, one question.
Of course, this is related to refugees now, but with human trafficking actually as well. Have you thought about changing policies which differentiate grown-up people from minors? Because with refugees and therefore also with people who are brought to Austria via human trafficking, the problem is that they have privileges if they are under the age of 18. And therefore, often, of course, they don't have any ID. They can't prove it. If you bring a proof, if you bring a certificate of birth, I had this with a refugee my family adopted, they don't accept it. So have you discussed this? If you could change the policy, that it's not that attractive for people to claim to have a wrong age?
We did discuss the topic that minors will sometimes give a different age, depending on who they are talking to, whether they're talking to the police, whether they're talking to a social worker, and depending on which country they are in. But we also discussed that it's not always the case that someone who's 19 years old says that he's 17. It might also be the case, as was mentioned on this morning's panel, that someone who actually is a minor says that they are an adult. Because perhaps they receive information, like we talked about the case of Greece, where minors, if someone says that they are a minor, then it might be the case that they are held in a center and are not able to move freely. So this would be a reason in Greece to say, no, I'm not a minor, I'm an adult. Whereas in Austria, it's often the other case. It's the other way around, that there's maybe more incentive to say that you're a minor when maybe you're actually a young adult. But we did not talk about specific policies.
Okay, thank you. Without further ado, I would just hand over to the third workshop. And actually, we have two presenters here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So our question was, well, the session was titled Migration Control, Criminal Justice and a Human Rights-Based Approach to Human Trafficking, How to Serve All. And so we spent some time in the group speaking about, to return to Helmut's theme about ambiguity and what exactly is meant by a human rights approach and how that can be interpreted in different ways by different actors and different observers. And just to pick up on some other points that have been made and that were made in the group, the problem too is that we can speak about rights as being a right, not a luxury, not a privilege, But in practice, how rights regimes work out is that there is a distinction between the social rights that attach to citizens on a particular territory and then the rights that others, on non-citizens on the territory, are entitled to. And part of the problem too is that a lot of the way to get a slightly more rights is if you can demonstrate that you have suffered, and so or that you belong to a particular category that's recognized as vulnerable, as you mentioned, a child, a person under 18, that somehow. So there are unequal rights, and you've got people who are having to sort of perform their suffering or perform their vulnerability in some way in order to access rights that a citizen would otherwise just enjoy. So I'm entitled, if my employer doesn't pay me, I don't have to prove to anybody that was brutalized or suffered. I simply have that as a labor right that will be enforced without anything else. So the problem that people in the group identified as being a difficulty is that there's some human rights, what are termed human rights-based approaches are actually what they'd call victim-centered or victim-focused rights-based approaches, which then means that somebody has to have, it's like the threshold for accessing your rights has been raised so that you have to demonstrate a certain level of victimhood before you're actually entitled to rights. So that was one of the things we discussed. And then, having noted that there's all these ambiguities around what we mean by rights and who's entitled, who is the subject of different types of rights, we discussed the fact that there isn't necessarily any contradiction between criminal justice and a human rights-based approach. The two could be highly compatible, in fact. But it depends on what's being criminalized. So, I mean, again, there are ambiguities. So if the primary purpose and aim of criminal justice is being directed to make border controls and migration controls more effective, then you can end up with a situation where somebody like Lisbeth Zornig is identified as a trafficker and criminalized as such, and that might mean that criminal justice in that case is compatible with migration control, but it hardly seems to be compatible with any desire to promote and protect the human rights of migrants. And you can have, on another level too, the same contradiction comes into play with the distinction between trafficking and smuggling, which is, again, often very ambiguous and shady and fuzzy. So you can end up with people being criminalized as traffickers when, in fact, what they have done is to offer smuggling services to a person who actually wanted that service and whose life chances have ultimately been greatly enhanced by the provision of those services. So I think that the group was talking about how you could have criminal justice could be used to serve the interests of human rights or to promote a rights-based approach, but then on the other hand, sometimes it isn't used in that way. We thought that it's much more difficult to think how you combine, when we asked the question about how to serve all, it's much more difficult to see how you would combine the ambition to control migration with a rights-based approach, because obviously the entire point of immigration controls is to restrict the rights and freedoms differentially of citizens and migrants who enter the state. So we discussed, because Rada was telling us about how in Lebanon we're not even only talking about irregular migrants, but also how people can enter quite legally on artist visas, and yet the visa that they're given then restricts their freedom to such extent and makes them so dependent on the super nightclub owners who employ them that in fact it amounts to state-facilitated trafficking in many cases, she was arguing. And we can see how in the UK as another example with its domestic work visa, which again ties domestic workers to their employers, and in that sense places, you know, far greater restrictions on the choice and freedom of the migrant domestic worker than I or other British nationals would experience in any workplace, and that again limits choices. So we discussed how immigration controls are actually end up constructing layers of or a hierarchy in terms of what kinds of rights people might be able to lay claim to, and so that some humans end up having more rights than others on a given territory, and that is part of the problem that creates vulnerability and leaves open a space that can be exploited by traffickers. And that can happen even when we're talking about migration within the EU, because of course some nationals of some EU states have restrictions placed on them in regards to access to the labour market when they move to other EU states. I think that was all I could do of the problem of how whether those three things, whether you could serve all. I think that the conclusion was it was much more difficult to combine all three: migration control, criminal justice and human rights, than it would be to combine human rights and criminal justice alone. But we then observed that we have to work with the territory that we're on, and as I'm not very good at that, as you'll all have noticed, I'm going to hand over to Marco to bring us to the real world.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, I should be the conservative one, talking about what is our framework, where migration is restricted. There are limits, there are borders, and so this poses some questions. Of course, what you reported is food for thought, and I think it should also bring us to revise our way of looking at these issues. But also, maybe I'm not so conservative, just saying that, in fact, it's quite disappointing that we are still discussing the basics. I mean, still we are saying that we need victim protection, that we need that persons are not criminalized when they are recognized as trafficked persons, which still is the case. So, in fact, if we look at our real world and at what has been done in terms of anti-trafficking legislation, victim protection legislation, which is entailed in those pieces of legislation, all these years of anti-trafficking advocacy and work and efforts and so on, and what we really have on the ground, well, that's disappointing. And nevertheless, we all were very active in our working groups, which means we want to work for trafficked persons' rights. And in fact, because we were divided in 3 subgroups in our workshop, and in the work group I was in, the initial question was, now things are much more complicated than before. because before we had illegal migrants, we had refugees, we had trafficked persons. Well, it was not so simple, but now really it's very confusing, and it's very difficult to distinguish, and it's very difficult to say how to call that person, and also therefore to determine the rights that person is entitled to. But yeah, person, that's the key word. So rights. The person is entitled to rights. So that is the first issue. So we might have refugees, we might have trafficked persons, we might have illegal migrants. Anyway, the basic rights should be granted. Then there are some specific rights those people are entitled to if, for example, they are trafficked persons. And still the problem is that the ability to recognize trafficking is not there. So, in fact, still we have to say we need fully implemented anti-trafficking strategies and trafficked persons protection interventions. So when we talk about anti-trafficking strategies, we might talk about prevention, also in a very practical way, looking at the origin countries, but not only countries, cities, villages, so that we can implement targeted prevention initiatives. And in the working group 2, also addressing the demand was mentioned as one important issue which is often neglected. And when we talk about protection, then the answer was SOPs, which is not just a technical word, it's standard operating procedures, which means how we are able to recognize the signs of trafficking, how we are able to recognize a trafficked person and to build trust so that that person recognizes him or herself as a trafficked person. And that's not easy at all. So SOPs is not a technical word, is really the way in which the rights of trafficked persons could be granted. And of course, they have to be implemented by specialized agencies, the anti-trafficking system. So that is why we need anti-trafficking system, national action plans, working on prevention and everything. But then we also need national referral mechanism, and just half of the EU member states have national referral mechanisms in place. So that's an issue. And if we talk about SOPs, even less have effective and really working SOPs in place. SOPs means multi-agency work, means that law enforcement, labor inspector agencies, social services providers and so on are able to work together in order to grant victims' rights. But also we need that the frontline practitioners, officers, working, for example, on mixed migration flows for the refugees or the juvenile justice system, the unaccompanied minor system, are able to recognize those signs. And so we also need multi-agency work, we need training, of course, distinguished for the level of specialization. Because we need to put the person in a position to choose. If we have a person which has been trafficked and also is entitled to the refugee status, for example, that person should be able to choose between the two different paths. But anyway, we have to put the person in the position to choose to be recognized as a victim, but also to feel that there is a chance for a better life and for future. And this means social inclusion, which still is too less prioritized in the European scenario, in our country's scenario. Social inclusion also means building trust, also means granting the rights and also granting the societies, which in this way feel safer and less vulnerable. A way of achieving these goals is also, it was mentioned, because it should be taken for granted, but apparently it's not the case. NGOs should have a role in policy making. We know that this is happening in many countries, but maybe in some others not. And this also would be a way of giving trafficked persons a voice. Okay.
Thank you. That was an excellent final remark also. Thanks also to Mark Buffer and Julia O'Connell-Davidson for the co-presentation of the workshop findings. At the moment, I think we are actually coming quite to an end, but still I would be ready to take at least 2 questions from the audience. Comments, remarks, questions on the findings, the results from the workshops, on the things, the issues we just discussed. So if there is some immediate question or, well, not statement anymore. Well, it's always difficult at the end of such a long day. There's one raised hand to my left. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludmila Bogdan, University of Vienna, PhD student. And yeah, I would love to make a statement, because from my workshop, which I really enjoyed, it was with Evelyn, we basically, all the groups decided, and we came to the conclusion that many anti-trafficking organizations are playing a huge role in shaping public perception who is a victim of human trafficking. And for many years, those organizations kept focusing on sex trafficking. Now, of course, the good thing is that some of them started raising awareness about forced labor, including, kind of shaping a bit differently the profile of who can become a victim. But still, not at the rate that we would love to actually learn more, because I'm personally a researcher, so I can talk about the case of Moldova. But when I talk to the people, regular populations, it's still, many of them have been trafficked, but they are not identifying themselves as victims. So I see a problem when it comes to anti-trafficking organizations shaping the public perception of who is a victim and the profile. And another subtopic is the way those organizations are using to portray those victims, because it's not empowering at all. And it's also it raises huge questions. If you're always portraying those victims as being very vulnerable, very weak, usually of female gender and so on, does this really help? Because in Moldova, usually what those organizations are trying to do is just to scare people to go abroad. Basically saying if you travel, you'll be trafficked, that's it. And that's not gonna stop, people still traveling and being trafficked. And then when those people return back home, and I'm talking to them, why didn't you seek help? What they are saying, well, I was informed by them that I will be trafficked, so I am still allowed to seek help. So this is a huge problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. Because you actually just remarked on very important points, and I think we can accept it as they are. Any further questions, perhaps, from those brave participants in this final round? Because otherwise, I don't know if any one of you from the panel would like to give a final observation. Because for me, I think it was an impressive lineup we have seen in the morning in terms of commitment. We have seen members of the Austrian government. We have seen Madame Czabu-Simonova as the principal figure in the OSCE context to address trafficking in human beings. And of course, the experience from the last 10 years, anti-trafficking days shows there is no lack of commitments, but on the other hand, we also heard of practical examples of tools which have been adopted also in the Austrian context, most recently on child trafficking and on domestic services. It has also been mentioned the Greater Companion of Good Practices, which was published this week also, where you can find an overview of what has happened on the positive side, not to leave us all too disappointed perhaps at the moment, at the end, what is happening on the positive side in so many countries across the region. On the other hand, I think, as it has been stressed by so many participants, the human rights-based approach and human rights as such, I think they should be the underlying basis for all our action, because we all have so many identities, and it shouldn't matter whether we are labeled a migrant, a refugee, a trafficked person, a human rights person, a social worker, a judge. We all have our identities, multiple identities. We all may face multiple vulnerabilities, but we all also have our basic human rights. So in that context, I would thank everyone from the participants. I would thank the organizers, on behalf of the organizers, the OSCE, the Austrian Task Force and the Foreign Ministry, IOM and VITC as the organizers of this event. And a special thank you also to our interpreters. I was even given the name Heinz Schmolz and Gabriele Gallo for the excellent translation they have provided to us. So thank you again, and probably we see each other next year again. Thank you.